Hey everyone, welcome to Arch's Garage, and this video is going to be a comprehensive look on how I diagnose and repair issues with the EX series engines. This one I have in front of me right here is an 875 EX, so this is an example of a really big one. But this diagnostic and repair, head gasket repair, and valve lapping, valve repair, it's really the same on all of them. This is a much bigger motor, and this is off a pressure washer. But it's the same engine. This is just a bigger version of the one that we're going to be working on. They all have the same problems. On this video, we're going to focus in on doing the diagnostic, how I do a diagnostic on one of these. These are the common lawnmowers that you'd find at Home Depot and Lowe's. Many of you may have them out there. And, you know, all of a sudden one day it's running good, and the next thing you know, it doesn't want to run anymore. Now, it doesn't just happen, right? It can happen over time. It's a thing that develops over time. But you'll see why, I believe, on this particular machine that we're going to be working on, why it happened. The person hit something. And when they hit it, it caused the flywheel to spin. And the flywheel spun on the key, on the shaft, so that needed to be replaced. But what happens then is that the cylinder pressures go up very high. When you hit something and the engine stops or meets that kind of resistance very abruptly, cylinder pressures are going to rise. And since these engines are notorious for blowing out head gaskets, that's when it's going to happen. And then, of course, after that, it doesn't run anymore, right? And then you have several problems wrong with the engine. Be back in a bit, guys. Stick with me. All right, everybody, I'm going to start off with doing a diagnostic on this motor. So I'm going to go through what I usually go through, and we're going to start off by taking the carburetor off. There's 4 screws, there's 2 sets. The silver ones actually go into the plastic of the carburetor, and you could use an 8mm socket for that. The other one is, the other 2 are black. They go into the metal bracket that sort of holds everything on. And that's like 5/16. So we want to get this off, and we'll get to the carburetor, and we'll pull the carburetor off. And I'm actually going to do a carburetor rebuild on this as a separate thing. It's not really going to be part of this video. Also, we got to take off the gas tank. I recommend cleaning that well, put some detergent in it. There's almost always junk in there, and I'll push that to the side. But I'll put some detergent in it, rinse it out with the hose, wash it out really good. Get some gasoline in it a little bit, slosh it around, and blow dry it. All right, now we can just give a tug, pull the carburetor right towards you, tilt it, and pull the Z bends off. I'm going to pull the plug out now and it's a 5/8 socket. So we'll pull that plug out, take a peek at it. It'll help me determine what's going on with the engine. At least I can see it and see if it's running really rich, or is it running lean, or is a lot of junk on it. So let's take a look at the plug. Just a quick peek. It looks actually, it looks pretty good. We're good there. Let's move to the next step. What we want to do now is a compression test, and I'm putting in some solvent. It's transmission mix. It'll help clean things up, break up the junk, the carbon, and drive out any moisture that might be in there. I'm going to tie back the handle with that Velcro you see, and we'll be able to spin it with my drill. Now at this point, I'm just going to give it a spin by hand to feel it. I want to feel the engine. You can pick up a lot of information just from what you see and you feel, you can hear. Check the oil real fast. There's some oil in there. It's not very good, but it's your typical old used oil. I don't see any water in it. I don't smell anything that's off. And I'll spin it first. It'll puke out whatever junk is in there. Put some rags in the way. Now listen. See if I hear anything.
I don't hear anything. A little bit of
Let's check spark. Now let's do a compression test. I don't see anything. I'm going to put my finger over the hole as best I can and just feel and see if I can feel any compression. Sometimes the gauges get junk in them from all the crap that's in these engines that haven't been run. And they don't work. And I have to take them apart and clean them out. But let's see if I get anything. I'm not feeling anything. So this is a good test. It should blow your finger off, okay? And it's not doing that. So we need to look a little bit deeper. Now, sometimes what can happen is the valves won't seat because there could be some carbon on them, or maybe one valve is open and it rusts. I'm going to try a different gauge and see if I get anything.
Sucking good. It's blowing out the exhaust a lot.
Nothing. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to squirt some oil in. And what that's going to do is it's going to tell me if the problem is rings or valves. By putting the oil in, if there's any damage to the cylinder walls and rings, it'll help it to seal, and it'll get some kind of a reading. If there's something wrong with the valves, or if it's a blown head gasket, nothing will happen. So let's find out what's going on.
She could be scored. All right.
Take the flywheel nut off and take a peek in there and let's look at it. Yeah, it's no good. Yeah, the crank key's been spun. Here's a look at the blade. This is what was on there, and we could see the blade's a wreck. So the engine saw some damage. The blade is very damaged. But I'm just going to do like a quick look, just a quick measurement, just to see if the crank is bent, but it's not. And in part, the reason why it's not is because there's a pulley adapter on there with a big collar on it, and it helps to brace the shaft considerably. So that's the reason why the crank didn't bend. I'm going to put on another blade and double check this. Just going to grab a good used blade from stock, throw it on there, measure it again, take another look, and just to verify that there's nothing wrong with the crankshaft. I recommend doing this at the very beginning of your diagnostic. I should have shown you this at the very beginning because you want to see if the crank is bent. If the crank is bent, you might just want to throw out the motor. You can bend a crankshaft back to true, but you might want to watch some videos on that. I don't recommend it. Not for these cheap motors. All right, guys, it's time to take the head off, and we're going to start off with removing the rocker cover, and we want to remove the exhaust. So 5/16 pulls the rocker cover off, and we just want to pry it a little bit. Be careful. We can reuse the gasket. You should be able to get it off in one piece. I've got the entire chassis up a little bit. This way oil goes back to the back of the block and it won't spill out as we pull the rocker cover off. Now, next step here is we just want to inspect the rockers and put them through their valve events to see what's going on in here. Make sure that it looks correct. So what's moving now is the intake just moved, and now the exhaust is starting to move. And what we want to do is try to bring it up to TDC. So we're going to look at the magnet on the flywheel, and you want to align it with the armature or coil. And it should be between the two events. So when the exhaust closes and the intake closes and all that is in the middle, right, we should be at TDC. All right, we just had a decompression bump on the exhaust. See? See it? Now the magnet's at the top. And that's TDC. All right, and you should be able to feel it too, because there'll be a bit of slack feeling where the connecting rod and the crankshaft kind of like sort of zero out, where it's not going down and it's not coming up. I'm just shaking the rocker arms, make sure they're loose. This is an example of a head that I already reworked. I set the valves in, lapped them, and cleaned everything up. So we could put this on, and it'll go right on. It's identical head. They're all the same. But I'd like to show you in this segment how to lap the valves, clean the head. You know, we're not going to just remove the head, but we're going to remove it, clean the head, clean the valves, lap the seats, and get everything just to the point where everything is just ready to go back on. We know the valves are going to seat. And one of the reasons for that is that the valve springs are so light that any carbon or rust or whatever between the valve seat, the valve face, and the valve seat could cause it to leak, and then it's just not going to seal properly. All right, I put a wobble extension on because there's a hump here from the drive system, so I need to get around that. So I'm going to zip these off, and I'm going to take everything off very carefully, keeping an eye on what I see, because I'm looking for evidence, anything. I don't know, it could be anything, so that's why you just want to pay attention. Just slowly take it off, take a peek inside, and we'll get a closer look in a minute. Okay, so what I see here is carbon tracing or tracking in the air that I'm pointing to, and that's evidence of a gasket leak. The gasket blew out. You can see the discoloration. That's where combustion gases were pushing their way through. Now I'm pointing to right there, and I'll show you again in a minute, those are valve stem caps. Be careful, they'll fall off. You don't want to lose those. Going a little bit closer. I'm just kind of looking around, feeling for any ridges or junk in the cylinder walls. And here's an example of a gasket I took off another motor, and you can see it has a crack in it. This one has 2 cracks in it. The other one had 1 crack in it. So now we know why there's no compression. And you can also see some burning or carbonization on the face of the block. So it's time to clean it up. All right, guys, now you can skip this part. It's not imperative that you do this. You could probably just put all this back on, give it a cleaning, clean the combustion chamber. But yeah, you could probably skip this, but I would recommend it. Now, these are the lash caps, and they come off real easy, and you will lose them. They're to spread the load on the tip of the valve stem because they're so small. I've cleaned up some of the parts. I haven't done the valves yet. We're going to take the valves out now, but first we have to remove the valves by removing their retainers. So we're just going to push down on the retainer, compressing the spring, and you see there's like a keyway in there, and we're going to slide it over, and it'll release. It's just super easy. Now make sure you get the bolts cleaned really good, especially the threads. And that's it, guys. We'll just push the valves out. Now be careful, there is a seal, which you'll see again a little bit. There's a seal on the intake. That's to keep oil from going into the combustion chamber. The exhaust doesn't need it because it would just burn off in the exhaust. Inspect the valves. Make sure they're straight and they look okay. You see a lot of carbon on at least the intake side.
20 minutes later.
I've ran the valves on the wire wheel and the valve faces and the shaft and the stem and everything, and it's clean, but we're going to hit them in a little bit. What I'm doing here is I'm spinning them to check them for straight. And I'm doing it on this sort of corrugated tabletop that I have. And that's what it would look like if they were bent. They would sort of act like this. Well, you can also look at it, and sometimes they're so bad that you can actually see the stem is bent. Put some valve lapping compound on the valve face and just drape it all around the face. But you don't want to get it on the valve stem or into the valve guide, because when we spin this, it'll cause wear, and it's just, you don't want an abrasive. It's pretty sharp abrasive. Take a piece of fuel line, two-stroke type hose, put it over the valve stem or tip, and then chuck that up in your drill, and then spin it.
Now, by moving it in and out, it puts fresh material on for grinding. Let me show you this way. Couple minutes, that's all you need. This will mate the two surfaces together, and we'll be able to check them to make sure they're clean and that they're sealing. If you want, we can go backwards for a little bit. Doesn't really matter. Clean it off. See how nice that works? And let's take a look at what we got. Oh yeah, now you should see a gray band all the way across. And we have that. Perfect. That one's done. We're going to wash that off. We want to check the seat as well. You don't want to get any compound down into the guide, so we'll re-rinse the head. It's perfect. We're going to re-rinse this. Any gook out in here, and we'll run a brush in it too. All right, now we can do this one. That's perfect.
Okay, now I'm checking the other valve. This looks like the exhaust valve, and it looks good. Beautiful.
A few moments later.
This step is also optional. You don't have to do this. If you have a piece of glass, or in this case, a nice flat piece of steel, I've got 80 grit, and I've got some 220. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the head over it, back and forth, changing to rotating the head. And it's a poor man's mill. So, or surface grinder, really, is what it is. And it will remove enough metal to flatten the head, because these heads warp. And that's one of the reasons why the gasket blows out. It's also great for preparing the surface for the gasket. So just back and forth a little bit. I'll spend a little bit of time, maybe 10 minutes. And then once I see there's a nice continuous ring of all around the surface of the head, on the gasket surface, I know I've pretty much flattened it, and then I'll finish up. See, I'm actually looking right now for indications of where the grit hasn't touched the head surface, and there's a few spots. And as I said, when I'm done, I'll finish up and sort of polish it on the 220. Now I'll change directions, so maybe rotate the head a little bit, and then go back and forth a little.
It's removing material. There we go. A little bit over here it needs.
Now it's time to polish the shaft. There you go, guys. It's time to polish the shaft. Use a little Scotch-Brite, dip it in a little solvent, go back and forth, feeling for burrs. And this way, you don't want the valve stem to get stuck in the head. Now it's time to put everything together. This looks pretty clean in here. And you want to do another wash to make sure that there's nothing left over in there. So I'm going to put some oil on everything to assemble it. You don't need anything fancy on this. I used white grease on the other head because I was going to store it. The bigger valve is the intake, the smaller valve is the exhaust. Now, by placing my finger underneath the valve, that'll kind of hold it up, and then I can just reverse the procedure I did earlier. Drop the spring down, pass it through that little keyway, get it centered, release, and you're done. And when I'm done with this, we'll put a little oil on top, and then we'll put the lash caps back on. The lash caps, valve caps. Now you can take the rockers off to do this. Generally I do, but this time I just decided not to. I wanted to see if there was any advantage. Theoretically, you could put this entire assembly back on and you wouldn't have to readjust the valves, but you did take everything apart, and it's a good idea to do that now. Now we're ready to put it on. Coat it with oil, just a little bit on the gasket surface and everything.
Eventually,
Spray a little solvent on it.
Everything's looking good. Everything's nice and clean. I'm just going to wipe out whatever the junk that's in there from cleaning and spraying. Put a little bit more solvent in. Wipe everything down. Don't let the wire wheel go into the cylinder. Right? You'll score it. It won't seal. So now what I'm doing here is I'm going to run my bolts into the bosses of the block. Where the threads are, and make sure everything is clean. And anybody that watches my channel, you often hear me say, don't torque head bolts if they haven't been out and cleaned and everything is lubricated. You torque when everything is clean. If you have to chase the threads out with a tap or a thread chaser type tap, you wheel the threads on the bolts, you lubricate everything. And in some cases, on some headset kits and bolt, they come with bolts, specialty bolts, or certain manufacturers actually call out what type of lubricant should be used to get a specific torque reading. I'm going to be using the ARP Ultra Torque. This is fastener lubricant. It's like a grease, and it's for this. It's for torquing torquing everything down. I did use a little bit of motor oil coating the cylinder up around the piston, on the face of the block, and also the face of the head. And you can also put a little bit of oil on the bolts, but not on the threads. So if you want, you can dunk them, and then you can put your ARP lubricant on. There's many lubricants you can use, but this is what I have, and so I'm just going to orientate the gasket. All right, the head's on, and I'm just going to snug up the bolts by hand and try to hold the head so that it feels like it's centered. It'll actually move around a little bit, so just make sure it's aligned, snug them up, and what you should be feeling is that the bolts are going in consistently. They're not getting hung up, they're not stiff. So this is just a cool tool I've had for a really long time. And so now I'm going to just, like I said, snug them up by hand. All right, it's time to torque them up. 220 inch-pounds. You can divide it by 3. It's a good idea to take it in increments, so about 75 pounds. And what I'm finding here is that, 75 inch-pounds. And what I'm finding here is that my snugging is pretty darn close to the 75 inch-pounds. So I'll notch it up, make another pass, and then do a cross pattern, and I'll finish up at the 200.
All right, let's go up to 220. Okay, here's our 220. Beautiful. We'll come down here. Beautiful. All right, we're done.
Few inches later.
All right, time for push rods, and the push rods are identical. So you just want to slide them in, and you want to try to feel the cam lifter, and you'll feel it, and it'll kind of like slide into a pocket. Now, generally, I have the rocker arms off, so you're going to have to kind of push with your finger down on the front of the rocker arm and try to sort of twist the rocker arm around to get the push rod underneath the rocker arm. You could take it off because we're going to have to go through these adjustments anyway. But with a little bit of force, you'll get it in. Like I said earlier, that the springs are so light. Just work it, and you see I've got the first one in place, and I'll work the second one, and we'll be ready for adjustments. Now that everything's on, we can turn the engine over and just watch the valve events. So I've got the push rods in, the rocker arms are in place, and I just want to see, does it feel like it's going good? There's the intake going down, and it'll come back up in a minute. And we just want to see everything is okay. And then we're going to get ready to check them because they're probably going to need adjustment, which is usually why I take them off, but this time I just didn't feel like it. Theoretically, you could run them from just like this because really nothing changed. But you got everything off, it's a good time. I used to say, while you're there. So let's go check them out. Okay, valve clearance is 5 thousandths intake, 8 thousandths exhaust. Exhaust is typically larger on most engines because it grows. So I'm going to grab a 5 thousandths. I'm going to stick them in both and see what's going on. Then I'll go to the 8 thousandths on the exhaust. Those are the clearances for like max. Now you have a range. So when I go to set it, to try to make them a little bit tighter and get them snug, I'll go 4 thousandths on the intake, and I'll go 7 thousandths on the exhaust. We have to loosen the outer nut, which is actually part of the fulcrum, the center fulcrum of the rocker arm. And we're going to loosen that. And then we can turn in or out the center, which is a lock. Now, the nut and the fulcrum are one. They're part of the same thing. And again, the center is a lock. So if in this case, we need to go a little bit tighter. And what I'm trying to show here is you got to balance the two. So to start off with, turn the nut portion of it counterclockwise, and that will actually loosen everything up. If you try to just loosen the center lock by itself, it might be stuck and you won't be able to do it, and you risk breaking the Torx on the end. So just pull the nut around a little bit And then in this case, what we need to do is to drive the nut in a little bit more. We have to turn the center out to make a little bit of room, right? So we could drive the nut. Otherwise, you're just going to be returning everything to the point where you originally started. So pull the center out a little bit, drive in the outer, which is the nut, turn it in just a little bit, then sort of snug up the center because you need to take up the slack, right? Because the slack, the threads have some slack in it, and it affects the total clearance. And then check it. And it's a dance, it's back and forth. I'm not really going to show you exactly how to do this here because it's really beyond the scope of this video, and the video is getting long. I do have other videos on how to do this where I go through it more in depth. But just briefly, some tips on how to do this. And you're going to want to make sure it's about 4 7 thousandths. That's 4 thousandths on the intake, 7 thousandths on the exhaust. And again, the exhaust, usually I like to make it a little bit more because the exhaust grows as it gets hot. It's the exhaust side. It's going to get really hot. It will grow, actually taking up some of the clearance, and it'll tighten up a little bit. So you want a little bit more clearance cold. You want to do this kind of cold, about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, room temperature. If you're doing it when it's hot, when the engine's hot, you're not going to get an accurate reading. We're going to move to the next part, and again, check out some of my other videos on how to do this. Now, one last tip is when you're done and you feel like you've got the proper setting, then that feeler gauge should just have a little tug on it. And so tighten it one last time, but what you do is you tighten it. Don't put any tool in the center. Just take the outer wrench, snug it down, right? It'll drive both of them in together and sort of jam them into place, and then it'll be tight. And then that's it, and you're done. Okay, it's time to put everything else back together. You don't need anything fancy on the rocker cover. Just put it back. Just make sure the gasket's in good shape. If you want, you could actually glue the gasket to the cover with either RTV or Gorilla Snot. But we're going to put everything else back on, go through everything, and do what I usually do, and we'll come back for a test.